What if the man you gave your last money to was worth $2 billion? What if the stranger you fed from your own plate owned the restaurant? What if the person you treated with kindness, when the whole world treated him like nothing, was watching everything? This is not a fairy tale. This is not luck. This is what happens when a woman with nothing gives everything she has, and a man with everything finally discovers what he was missing. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you will never look at a stranger the same way again. The rain fell hard that Tuesday evening in Seoul. Sandra had just finished a 12-hour shift at the community health clinic in Itaewon, a low-income neighborhood tucked beneath the loud, glittering promise of the city. Her scrubs were damp. Her feet ached. Her bag was heavy with a folder of patient intake forms she still needed to review before morning. She was 29 years old, originally from Accra, Ghana, and she had been living in Seoul for 2 years on a medical volunteering contract that paid just enough to cover her rent, her meals, and the occasional phone call home to her mother. She was not wealthy. She was not connected. She was simply a woman who had chosen to show up every day for people who had nowhere else to go. She turned the corner toward the bus stop and nearly stepped on him. A man was sitting on the ground beside a closed convenience store, his back against the metal shutter, his knees drawn to his chest. He was Korean, perhaps in his early 40s, dressed in plain dark clothes, a worn jacket, simple trousers, old shoes. His hair was disheveled. His eyes were open but distant, staring at the wet pavement like a man whose thoughts had taken him somewhere very far away. No bag. No umbrella. No phone visible. Just a man sitting in the rain. Sandra stopped. Around her, people passed. A woman in a yellow raincoat walked by without a glance. 2 young men in hoodies crossed the street before even reaching him. A delivery cyclist swerved around the corner, indifferent. Everyone was moving. Everyone was somewhere to be. Sandra was also somewhere to be. She had a bus to catch. She had files to review. She had a phone call scheduled with her mother at 9 o'clock. But she stopped. "Excuse me," she said in Korean, careful with her pronunciation. "Are you okay?" The man looked up slowly. His eyes were dark and steady, not the eyes of someone drunk or in crisis, but the eyes of someone profoundly, quietly exhausted. Not the exhaustion of the body. Something deeper. The exhaustion of a person who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time. "I am fine," he said. His Korean was clean and educated, which Sandra noted without judgment. "You are sitting in the rain," she said simply. He looked up at the sky as if noticing it for the first time. A thin, humorless smile crossed his face. "So I am." Sandra looked at him for a moment longer. Then she reached into her bag, pulled out the small folded umbrella she carried everywhere, and held it out to him. He looked at the umbrella. Then at her. "I have another one at home," she said. She did not. But she said it anyway. He took it slowly, like a man who was not used to receiving things from strangers. "Thank you," he said, and the words came out careful and quiet, as if he meant them more than he knew how to show. Sandra nodded and walked on. She did not ask his name. She did not wait for more. She simply walked to her bus stop, stood in the rain because she had given her umbrella away, and caught the number 42 home. She did not think about the man again that night. But he thought about her. 3 days later, Sandra was eating lunch alone at a small pojangmika, a Korean street food stall, near the clinic. It was a modest place with plastic stools and laminated menus and an old woman who made the best sundubu jjigae in the neighborhood. Sandra came here twice a week because it was cheap and warm and because the old woman always gave her extra tofu without being asked. She was halfway through her meal when she noticed a man sitting at the far end of the stall, staring at the menu with an expression that was almost unreadable. Same dark jacket. Same quiet posture. It was him. She recognized him before she was sure she recognized him, the way you recognize a melody before you can name the song. The man from the rain. He ordered something small, just rice and kimchi, the cheapest item on the menu. He counted coins from his pocket before placing them on the counter. Sandra watched this from the corner of her eye. Not with pity. With attention. When his food arrived, he ate slowly and neatly, like a man who was either very hungry or very disciplined, and she could not tell which. She finished her own meal, gathered her things, then paused on the way out. "We met in the rain," she said, stopping beside him. He looked up. Recognition moved across his face, slow and certain. "The umbrella," he said. "Yes." She sat down on the empty stool beside him, not because she had decided to, but because something in the way he was sitting, so contained, so careful, made her feel that leaving without a word would be a small cruelty. "I am Sandra." "Junho," he said. "Do you live nearby, Junho?" Pause. Something shifted in his expression. Not discomfort but consideration, like a man deciding how much of a truth to offer. Temporarily, he said. She did not push. She ordered a second tea she didn't need and sat with him for 20 minutes, talking about small things. The weather, the neighborhood, the old woman's tofu. Junho spoke sparingly but precisely. Every word he used was the exact word he meant. Sandra found this interesting. When she stood to leave the second time, she left her takeaway portion of John, Korean pancake which the old woman had packed for her dinner, on the counter beside his tray. I always order too much, she said, which was not entirely true. He looked at the food, then at her. You don't have to do this. I know, she said. I want to. And she walked away before he could say anything else. Outside she did not look back. Inside, Junho sat very still for a long moment, staring at the food she had left him. He had eaten at Michelin-starred restaurants in 12 countries. He had been served by private chefs in homes with ocean views. He had sat at tables where a single bottle of wine cost more than most people's monthly salary. But no one had ever left him their dinner before. He ate every piece of it. Over the following 2 weeks, Sandra and Junho crossed paths 4 more times. Once at the street stall. Once near the bus stop. Once at a small bookshop where Sandra was browsing second-hand medical texts and Junho was standing in the Korean literature section, reading a page he didn't buy. And once at the clinic itself, where Junho appeared at the registration desk looking for treatment for a minor cut on his hand. Nothing serious, but badly bandaged with what looked like a piece of cloth torn from a shirt. Sandra cleaned and dressed the wound herself during a quiet afternoon, asking no unnecessary questions. She noted that his hands were not the hands of a man who had done manual labor all his life. The skin was not rough in the right places. The cut was from something sharp and clean, not rough and industrial. She noticed. She said nothing. Do you have family here? She asked while wrapping the bandage. Yes, he said. Do they know where you are? A long pause. No. Sandra tied off the bandage and looked at him. Are you in trouble? He looked back at her and something complicated moved behind his eyes. Not fear, not deception, but a kind of private battle between what he wanted to say and what he had decided not to. Not the kind you are thinking of, he said finally. What kind then? He considered. The kind a person makes for themselves, he said. When they need to understand something they cannot understand from the inside. Sandra didn't fully understand what he meant. But she recognized the shape of it, the shape of a person who had stepped away from their own life on purpose. She had done something like that herself once. Left a good job in Accra, left her family, left a relationship that was comfortable but hollow, and come to Seoul because she needed to understand something about herself that she couldn't find at home. So she nodded. And she didn't push. Come back if the bandage loosens, she said. Infection is not dramatic in the movies but it is very inconvenient in real life. Junho almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a full smile she had seen from him. I will remember that. He came back 2 days later, not because the bandage had loosened, but because the clinic was doing a free community meal, volunteers and patients eating together, something Sandra had organized herself with donations from 3 local businesses. He came in and sat at the end of a table, quiet and unassuming. He ate with the other people, elderly residents, migrant workers, young mothers with small children, and he listened more than he spoke. Sandra watched him from across the room and saw something she had not expected. He was paying attention to everything. Not casually. Deeply. The way an engineer studies a structure or a doctor examines a patient, looking for what was really there beneath the surface. He watched how people moved through the space. How they thanked the volunteers. How the children ate. How an old man at the corner table ate his soup with 2 hands around the bowl, as if the warmth of it were the main thing he had come for. When the meal ended, Junho stayed to help stack chairs. No one asked him to. He just did it. It was a Saturday evening in early autumn when Junho told Sandra a small piece of the truth. They were walking along the Han River after Sandra's shift, a habit that had formed gradually the way real things form without being formally agreed upon. Junho would appear near the clinic around the time her shift ended, and they would walk, and sometimes buy tekbaki from a cart by the water, and talk until the city lights came on. Sandra had stopped trying to categorize what this was. It was not romance or not only that. It was something more complicated. The feeling of walking beside a person who was entirely present, entirely real, and entirely mysterious all at once. Can I ask you something directly? She said that evening. You can ask, he said. Where do you sleep? He was quiet for a moment. The river moved beside them, wide and gray and slow. A small room, he said. Near Mapo. Rented? Yes. And before? He stopped walking. He looked at the river. And then he said, quietly and without drama, before, I had more than I needed. Much more. And I realized one day that having more than you need can make you blind. To people. To the world. To yourself. Sandra looked at him. So you gave it up? I stepped away from it. Temporarily. He paused. I needed to know what it felt like to be ordinary. To need things. To ask for things. He turned to look at her. To receive things. Sandra was quiet for a moment. The city hummed around them. That is either very wise, she said, or very privileged. He let out a short, real laugh, the first fully unguarded sound she had ever heard from him. It is both, he admitted. I know that. And what have you learned? He looked at her steadily. That most people are kinder than I believed. That being helpless makes you visible in ways that being powerful does not. He paused. And that some people, he stopped. Some people what? He shook his head just slightly. I will tell you the rest another time. Sandra looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to the river. You can tell me, she said. I am not going anywhere. He said nothing. But he walked a little closer to her on the way back. October arrived and the trees along the Han River turned amber and gold. Sandra and Junho had fallen into a rhythm that neither of them had planned and neither of them questioned. They ate together several times a week. She lent him books she loved and he returned them with small paper notes tucked between the pages. Not traditional bookmarks, but observations. A sentence from a page he found interesting. A question the book had raised for him. Once, a single word, true. Sandra kept the notes. She did not tell him. He began coming to the community clinic as a volunteer. Not in any official capacity, he was not a medical professional, but he showed up on Saturday mornings and did whatever needed to be done. He organized supply rooms. He translated for elderly patients who spoke no English. He repaired a broken window latch with tools he bought himself and did not ask to be repaid for. The staff liked him. Mrs. Park, the senior nurse, told Sandra she was glad Sandra had brought him. I didn't bring him, Sandra said. He came himself. That is the same thing, Mrs. Park said, and walked away before Sandra could argue. One afternoon in the supply room, stacking boxes side by side, Sandra said, You are good at this. Stacking boxes? Being useful. Being present. Most people volunteer once and feel they've done enough. He was quiet for a moment. I was not always good at being present, he said. I was the kind of person who was physically in a room but mentally somewhere else. Thinking about the next problem, the next decision, the next quarter. He set a box down. I miss things. What kind of things? My father's last good year. My sister's wedding preparations. I attended the wedding but I missed everything that led to it. Dinners that mattered. Conversations that would have helped me. He looked at his hands. You cannot get those back. Sandra looked at him. There was a kind of grief in what he had just said, clean and honest and not asking for anything. You are here now, she said. Yes, he said. Because of choices I made. He looked at her. And a few things that happened to me that I did not choose. The way he said it, the quiet weight of it, made Sandra's heart do something unexpected. She turned back to the boxes. Come on, she said. We still have 2 more shelves. They worked side by side for another hour, shoulders occasionally touching in the narrow space, neither of them moving away. In November, Sandra's volunteering contract came up for renewal. She received a letter from the coordination office informing her that due to funding restructuring, her position at the Itaewon clinic would not be renewed beyond December. After December, the clinic itself would be at risk of closing unless a new funding source could be identified within 60 days. She read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it and put it in her drawer and went to work as normal. That evening, walking by the river, she told Junho. He listened without interrupting. His face was composed in the way it always was, attentive, still, giving nothing away prematurely. When she finished, he said, How many people depend on that clinic? Directly? About 400 registered patients. Mostly elderly, migrant workers, low-income families. Several of them have no other access point. No insurance, no transport to the bigger hospitals. And the funding gap? About 40 million won to keep it running for another year. 80 million to fully stabilize it for 3 years. He nodded slowly. What will you do? Write proposals, she said. Apply to every NGO and social welfare fund I can find. Organize a community fundraiser. She paused. Fight. He looked at her. You are not afraid. I am afraid, she corrected. I am just doing it anyway. He was quiet for a long time after that, looking at the water. Sandra, he said at last. Yes. What you have built there, the meal programs, the community trust, the volunteers, that is not a small thing. That is something most organizations spend years and millions trying to create and never manage. I know, she said quietly. That is why losing it would be devastating. He nodded once, and said nothing more about it. But that night, after she had said goodnight and walked to her bus stop, Junho stood by the river for a long time. He made one phone call. He spoke quietly, precisely for less than 4 minutes. He hung up and looked at the river. The first snow of winter had begun to fall on Seoul. The revelation did not arrive with fanfare. It arrived on a cold Wednesday morning in late November, when Sandra came to open the clinic and found a large black car parked outside, a kind she rarely saw in this neighborhood. A man in a dark suit stood by the entrance. Another sat inside the car. Before Sandra could say anything, her phone rang. It was Dr. Choi, the medical coordinator for her entire volunteering program. A woman who spoke with careful, professional calm and who Sandra had spoken to perhaps 4 times in 2 years. Sandra, Dr. Choi said. I have some news. The clinic's funding situation has been resolved. Sandra stood very still on the pavement. Snow was beginning to fall again. What do you mean resolved? We received an anonymous endowment this morning. Enough to operate the clinic for 5 years, with an additional capital grant to expand services. The funds came through a private foundation registered under the name Seon Foundation. Sandra said nothing. I know this is sudden, Dr. Choi continued. The donor has requested no public acknowledgement. Only one condition was attached to the endowment. What condition? That Sandra Mensah remain as the lead community coordinator for the duration of the program. Sandra lowered the phone slowly. She stood outside the clinic she had given 2 years of her life to in a city far from home, in the early winter cold, and she understood, before she understood it fully, that she already knew. She called Junho. He answered on the second ring. The clinic, she said. The Seon Foundation. Pause. Then quietly, yes. Junho. Her voice was steady but her hands were not. Who are you? A longer pause. When he spoke again, his voice was the same voice she had always known, careful, precise, fully present, but there was something new in it. Something like relief. My name is Junho Seon, he said. I am the chairman of Seon Group. We operate in 14 countries. Healthcare, construction, education, technology. He paused. We are worth approximately $2 billion. Sandra sat down on the steps of the clinic. You sat in the rain, she said. Yes. You counted coins for rice and kimchi. Yes. You helped stack chairs at a community lunch. Yes. Why? The word came out not as an accusation but as a real question. Genuine and quiet and urgent. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 3 years ago I was in a meeting in this same neighborhood, a site assessment for a development project. An old community building. We were planning to demolish it. He paused. I walked past your clinic before the meeting. I saw the line of people waiting outside. Elderly people. A mother with 3 children. A man in a delivery uniform who had obviously come straight from work. He stopped. I went into the meeting and I approved the demolition. Sandra said nothing. The building we demolished was not your clinic, he continued. But it was near it. 40 families lost their community center. I learned about this 6 months later, not from my team but from a newspaper. One paragraph. Page 11. His voice tightened just slightly. I had never even noticed. Sandra was very still. I started to ask myself what else I had not noticed, Junho continued. What other decisions I had made from a conference room that had consequences on a street level that I never saw. And I realized I could not answer the question. Because I had never been on the street. So you went to the street. I stepped away from the company, told my board it was a mental health sabbatical, which was not entirely false, and I spent 8 weeks living on a deliberate modest budget in neighborhoods I had only seen from a car window. Pause. And then it rained on a Tuesday evening in 81, and a woman in scrubs stopped when no one else did, and gave me her umbrella and said she had another one at home. Sandra put her hand over her mouth. I knew from that first evening that you were extraordinary, he said. I did not know then what I know now. But I knew you were the kind of person I had spent my whole life being too busy to notice. The snow fell softly around her on the clinic steps. Are you angry? He asked. Sandra thought about it honestly. She tested the feeling inside her, looking for betrayal, looking for the sting of deception. She found something, yes. A complicated something. but beneath it something else. Something that had been there since the river. Since the notes in the books. Since the way he stacked chairs and dressed his own wound with a torn piece of shirt because he had decided, deliberately, to know what need felt like. I am not angry, she said slowly. I am, she searched for the word. Rearranging. Rearranging. Everything I thought I understood about the last 3 months. I am putting it back in the right order. She paused. Give me time. I will give you whatever you need, he said. And Sandra. Yes. The clinic would have been worth funding regardless. I want you to know that. What you built there, I have seen many projects with 10 times the budget produce a fraction of the impact. His voice was steady and clean. This was not charity. This was an investment. In something real. Sandra nodded even though he couldn't see her. Come to the clinic on Saturday, she said. You want me to come? You still have 2 shelves to finish organizing, she said. Don't think the money gets you out of it. Junho laughed, fully genuinely, and it was the most beautiful sound she had heard in a long time. The weeks that followed were the most honest weeks of Sandra's life. Junho came to the clinic on Saturday and finished the shelves. He was introduced to the staff not as a chairman or a donor, but as Junho, Sandra's friend, a regular volunteer. He asked that this be kept private, and the small team honored it, partly out of respect and partly because, as Mrs. Park said, he is most useful when he is just a person. But the word had begun to change between them. Friend was no longer the exact word. Friend had been enough when they were strangers finding their footing. But something had shifted, had been shifting for weeks, quietly and without announcement, and now the space between them felt different. Warmer. More careful. More loaded with unspoken things. One evening, reviewing the clinic's new 5-year plan together at a small table in the corner of the break room, Junho with his reading glasses on, which Sandra had never seen before, Sandra looked up and said, You look different with those. Older? Human, she said. More human. He looked at her over the glasses. I was always human. I know. But you had this, she searched for the word. Composed face. Like someone who had learned to give nothing away. He took the glasses off and set them down. I learned that in boardrooms, he said, where showing anything was considered a weakness. It is not a weakness. I know that now. He looked at her directly. You showed me that. The way you move through the world, not guarded, not performing. Just present. Sandra held his gaze. I am guarded sometimes, she said honestly. I just stopped thinking it was the same as being strong. Junho reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. Not dramatically. Not as a declaration. Simply, the way you reach for something you have been wanting to reach for a long time and have finally decided the distance is no longer necessary. Sandra looked down at his hand on hers. Then she turned her hand over and held it back. They sat like that for a while in the quiet of the break room with the city humming outside, reading through a 5-year plan for a clinic in a low-income neighborhood in Seoul that was going to change several hundred lives. It was not a dramatic moment. It was better than dramatic. It was real. The following spring, Seoul Group held its annual public address, a major event covered by every major business publication in South Korea. Junho stood at the podium in front of shareholders, journalists, and executives, and he did something no one expected. He spoke for 40 minutes not about quarterly growth or market expansion, but about what he had learned in 8 weeks on the street. He spoke about the man who ate soup with 2 hands because the warmth was the point. He spoke about the community meal, about the volunteer who showed up every Saturday, about 400 patients who had nowhere else to go. He spoke about a woman who gave her umbrella to a stranger in the rain and said she had another one at home. He did not say Sandra's name. She had asked him not to. But he said this. The greatest failure of success is the belief that it has nothing to learn from the people it has left behind. I spent 20 years building something large, and 8 weeks understanding why it needed to be meaningful. Those 8 weeks were more valuable than everything before them. Because they taught me that proximity matters. That presence matters. That a person who sees you, really sees you, with no knowledge of your power, no interest in what you can give them, that person is the rarest kind of human being on earth. He paused. I have restructured our company's community investment policy. We will now require every senior executive in Seoul Group to complete 60 hours of direct community engagement per year, not writing checks, not attending galas, but being present. On the ground. In the rooms where the actual work is done. I believe this will make us better leaders. I know it made me a better person. The room was very quiet. In the back, dressed simply in a gray coat, Sandra watched from the last row. She had not wanted a front row seat. That was not why she was there. She was there because she had known, since the river walk in October, that she was in the life of a man who was genuinely trying to become something better, and that she wanted to be near that. Not because of the $2 billion. Not because of the clinic funding or the 5-year plan, or the way his name opened doors she couldn't open alone. But because of the notes in the books. Because of the stacked chairs. Because of a man who had everything and still chose to sit in the rain until someone noticed him, and then spent every day afterward trying to be worthy of the noticing. After the address in the hallway outside, Junho found her. "You stayed," he said. "I said I would." He looked at her for a moment. There was something in his eyes that had not been there in the rain that Tuesday evening in October. Something settled. Something that had found its place. "Sandra," he said. "Yes. I want to ask you something." "Ask." "Will you help me build the next part?" He paused. "Not the business. The person." A quiet beat. "I do not want to go back to who I was. And I think," he stopped, then started again. "I think the only way to make sure of that is to stay close to the people who knew me when I had nothing." Sandra looked at him. "You never had nothing," she said gently. "You had everything. You just couldn't see it yet." He nodded slowly, accepting this. "Will you stay?" he asked. And Sandra, who had left everything she knew to come to a city far from home because she needed to understand something about herself, Sandra, who had given her umbrella to a stranger in the rain and thought nothing more of it, Sandra, who had built something out of very little in the most honest way she knew how, looked at this man who had chosen to be small so that he could finally become large in the ways that mattered, and said yes. Narrator voice, warm, unhurried. "Here is what this story teaches us. Kindness is never wasted. You do not know who is watching. You do not know who is remembering. You do not know which small act, an umbrella, a plate of food, 20 minutes of conversation, is the one that changes the direction of a life. But more than that, this story teaches us that the most dangerous kind of poverty is not the kind that empties your pockets. It is the kind that empties your attention." Junho had $2 billion and could not see the people in front of him. Sandra had very little and saw everything. The richest person in a room is not always the one with the most money. It is the one who has learned to be fully present. Be the kind of person who stops in the rain. Be the kind of person who leaves food for someone who needs it. Be the kind of person who finishes the shelves, even when no one is asking you to. Because the world is watching. And the world is taking notes.